So hello and welcome back to Hacking Pro Tips Deep Dive number 3. Today we've decided to change it up, and I have the great honor of sitting down with Ben Siddiqui from HackerOne, also co-founder of Bug Bounty Forum. If you're not familiar with it, I definitely recommend you check that out because there's a lot of interesting resources there, especially the AMAs. They've helped me, and I'm sure that they will help many others. Today we are going to go into Recon. Ben's done a few different blog posts on HackerOne as well as conference talks on reconnaissance, being more effective with it, and I thought this was a great opportunity to sit down and deep dive into that and figure out what this all means. So Ben, thanks a lot for joining us.
Yeah, not a problem. Happy to be here.
Cool. So I thought for this we would take it off from the blog that you first published on HackerOne, which was how to recon and content discovery. Rather, that's the URL if people are looking for it. So you can just Google that from HackerOne blog post. But it really covers 4 different major areas, right? So it's talking about subdomains, GitHub, then it goes into kind of Amazon and some assets. And this was echoed in the conference talk that John and you had both worked on, and I'm blanking on the name of it now. Disrupt, was it Disrupt over in Europe?
So we did it at Disobey.
Disobey.
Yeah, in Finland.
Right. So, I mean, let's just get right into it. In the blog post, you talked about those major areas. The conference talks, again, talks about major areas. Are you really doing this all manually when you're looking at like GitHub, Amazon, subdomains? Like, what does that look like for you now?
So to give you a background about the blog post as a whole, why it became the way, how it became the way I wrote it was, I realized at one point that I was missing out a lot of good vulnerabilities that were getting disclosed on HackerOne because I wasn't going that extra step to do recon. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was the idea of I lack interest and knowledge in one area of hacking. It looks like it's helping a lot of people. So I want to understand it. So I first started doing a lot of it manually. So when I was doing the research for my talk, a lot of it was just manual, or I was just going to using tools, but I had to do them one by one. But that was just the foundation of what I wanted to understand. I wanted to understand how it works, what are the different methods, what are the different approaches, how I can make it fast as I go. So it first started 100% on manual. It was just for me to understand the process first before I can actually create an automated process around this entire method.
Okay. So I don't want to jump too far ahead, but is that where you're at now? Like, is you at kind of like an automated system?
So now I do 2 things. There are some things that I do not like to do automation for. So example, GitHub, I always say I don't like to automate GitHub because there's so much stuff you can miss by automation in GitHub that it's a better investment for me to sit down and go through it manually as I automate the rest of my work. So my terminal, whatever server I'm using, is doing all these different processes and does a couple of things we'll talk about later on. And then I sit on my other screen and I start looking at GitHub, for example. And that's because it's just a personal preference. Not that the tools aren't good enough, but there are times when you look at you find a password parameter or a password variable into a document or into a source code that's been released on GitHub, that it might be empty or it might have an old password, but you scroll down and you find internal subdomains, you find internal endpoints, other juicy info that nobody else would have caught on to if you just manually, or if you automated it and then you were just looking at the output of the tools, right?
Yeah.
For those reasonings, I like to use a lot of things manual when it comes down to GitHub. It's just building the passion and interest to actually read all those documentations, all the different source codes and files. I used to hate it, but as I saw a good return on investment in doing recon that way, that I just sucked it up and said, screw it. I'm just going to start looking at this all manually because it's been helping me improve my automation or my recon process.
That's okay. So yeah, there's a couple things that kind of came out of that. Like first and foremost, like I think I'm at that stage now where I'm starting to feel that more and more. Where like you see disclosed reports, you're like, it's the automated recon, or what I perceive to be the automated recon, that people are becoming extremely effective with, which is leading to higher impact vulnerabilities. That's not to say that there aren't other vulnerabilities that are being disclosed, but it seems like if you want to be the most effective, like it's to widen that lens. But for me, one of the things that I found is like it's easy to get down to a manual process, and you just like you said, like you got to find the energy to actually do this stuff. And I'm assuming for you, it's that return on investment. It's actually finding the vulnerabilities that is kind of avoiding the recon burnout that say is easy to fall into. At least that I know that I've felt, where you're just churning through things, not actually. It doesn't feel like you're hacking when you're doing that, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, that's really a good point. But there's also like the recon process. It's such a broad process that it's not really like something you can say, okay, this is what a good recon means. Recon could be different from one hacker for another, right?
Right.
But for me, it was just like, what areas can I just 100% hand off to tools and have a bunch of like scripts running after each other? And how I manage the outputs from those tools is what makes it a little bit different.
Yeah.
But also realizing that what areas are very, so a GitHub example has been a very good tool for me to make a lot of money. So I realized that, okay, if I do put in like 10 hours of just going through GitHub pages and I get a 10K bounty, 5K bounty, that's very well worth it.
Yeah, yeah.
So I realized that I need to focus on some areas of my own, and then some of it I can just say, like directory searches and stuff like that. I don't have to manually look at it. I can just grip through it, and we'll talk about all that as well.
Yeah.
And how I've automated all that stuff.
Okay. So before we dive into those nuts and bolts, one of the things that kind of comes to my mind with Recon and maturity of a program is just that. Does the maturity affect effective Recon for you? And I'm thinking, like, say, for example, like subdomain enumeration, right? Like, if everybody knows about the same tools, does it really make a difference if you're doing it, like approaching a new target versus not? Like how does that play out in terms of like a program's life?
So obviously, the bigger the scope, the better, right? So if we have a wildcard scope, that helps out a lot with the recon process, with automation, whatever that is. And the maturity of it makes it a lot better. So if a company has been around for years and years and years, chances are you can find documents from 2013, 2012 on GitHub versus a company that's recently launched 2 years ago. So the scope of work becomes a lot bigger. So for example, if you do Yahoo, you're going to find a lot of more documentation on GitHub versus a program that's just launched, or it's just they're in the beta testing or whatever that is. So yeah, the maturity of it makes a difference. Also, the company size makes a huge difference. The more employees they have, the more developers they have, there's a higher chance of them making a mistake, pushing the wrong code into GitHub, pushing AWS keys, whatever secret keys there is, into GitHub or whatever else. Yeah. So those make a huge difference into where you want to focus on.
That's interesting. And I mean, that's definitely the case with Shopify in terms of like the size and people shipping code. When people come to me and they ask me, like, should I continue to pursue Shopify? It's like, well, you ship code 100 times a day. So you definitely want to continue to look at it, but maybe that's where the automation plays into it, because it's not like every night you want to come in and sit down and re-look at the same GitHub repos. So there's some type of opportunity to look at what's changed. It seems like that would be a good opportunity to do that. And then, like you said, the output is, I think, like the crux of the issue, because it's so easy to grab a whole bunch of information, right?
Right. So it all comes down to how you process all that data. You can have the best tools. You can be running 200 different tools collecting data for Recon, but how you process those outputs from those tools is what matters and what makes a difference in my Recon to somebody else. Mine might be a little bit overboard because I do a lot of different manual checks or automatic checks that I do, where I grip through a lot of stuff, versus somebody might actually automate the whole process when they generate a report at the end of it and everything's done.
Right. So let's talk about a concrete example. I think this is a good segue into it. And you and John had talked about it at Disobey, where your 5K from Snapchat was essentially Jenkins disclosed. And from what John was talking about, that was a GitHub finding. Is that right?
That was not a GitHub finding, actually. Okay. So to give you another background on this story so I published this blog post on HackerOne. Then I sat down and I was like, does this method really work? Like, is it really working for me since I presented? Have I found any vulnerabilities? Right. So I sat down and said, okay, let's pick a list of public programs on HackerOne. Let's see which ones have a wildcard scope. So it's a huge scope of anything that they own. And then let's start going after those by looking at all their different assets. So for Snapchat, it's a little bit different because there wasn't a huge GitHub presence, and it wasn't easy for me to find employee resources on GitHub, because a lot of people were pushing code to GitHub for Snapchat or whatever apps they were developing. Right. So it was just like, okay, let's just start from the basics, subdomains. But if I'm going to go after subdomains and everyone else is using Sublister, Knock, whatever else other tools are out there, then I'm not going to get a different result, right? Exactly. So my idea was to go ahead and look into other ways of finding those subdomains that are super hard and not easily brute forceable, right? So something like Snapchat dash pattern Jenkins isn't easy to brute force because nobody has the keyword Snapchat in their directory or their brute force file that they're using, let alone doing patterns based on the company name.
Yeah.
So the answer to that was, where do I look for? So I've been doing a lot of certificate transparency research.
Okay.
So I gave it a try. I went on GitHub. I went on, not on GitHub. I went to Shodan and Census. But before I started doing my searches for Snapchat, I went to their scope and looked at all their subdomains or domains that they included. And then I looked at all their disclosed vulnerabilities. And I think in the blog post, I also mentioned that I saw a vulnerability that was disclosed by Shubs when he found some Django instances, brute force the password, got in, reported, and got a 5K bounty.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw that domain. I was like, oh, interesting. It has the word corporate in it. It has CS-corp. So that's got to be a corporate internal domain. So I immediately started, just my entire focus was to look into the corporate domain. So that's when I went to GitHub just to see if I find stuff. Limited stuff were found. I did a brute force for subdomains. It wasn't that great. Went on Showdown. It wasn't that great. Then the place that I hit jackpot was Census. I saw a ton of results coming out of Census. And I think like that vulnerability or that Jenkins instance was like number 2 or number 3 on Census's search results.
And so those search results, was it just like in the search bar, like just Snapchat? I think if I remember correctly from the slide, it wasn't too clear on the slide, but it looked like a much longer query. What did that look like? Was that just something that was created by like Census itself, or was that a specific query that you knew to run to go after assets?
So if you look into Census, when you look for a domain specifically, if you look at the results that it's giving you for that domain, at the bottom it shows you the queries that it's searching for in regards to that domain. One of them is the 443 HTTPS parse domains, I think is what it's called. So I just grabbed that from a previous search that I'd done from somebody else, and I've been doing a lot of work with it, and that's giving me a good amount of results, giving me a good amount of subdomains. So I just plugged that in. I said, okay, let's just look for any certificates on 443 that could be pointing to Snapchat Corp. And sure enough, that came up. And then the next step was dev, prod, and some other instances. So I enumerated a bunch of different lists, and I listed all the ones that were valid. So it was dev, product, internal maybe, and some other ones. And then one out of like 5 or 6 or so, whatever that number was, one of them actually worked, and one of them actually logged me in.
Wow. I guess we should kind of take a side step for those that might be new to this or might be familiar with Recon. When we're talking about the certificates, we're talking about like the SSL certificates. So what enables HTTPS? Anytime you register that, it becomes public. And so one way to look through and find subdomains is for when people are registering specific subdomains and doing that with SSL. So that's interesting. That's now Census also provides an API. Have you looked at tying that into your Recon?
So I was thinking about doing the whole idea of building the API into my Recon process, but unfortunately, since the new release, there's some limitations with it. I know I'm not the only one that's unhappy, but also Census and Showdown are like, now that have become they used to be a priority. Now I have been using it less and less because I found a better API. So in some of my talks, I don't think this was included in this survey, but I talk about something called Search Spotter. This was pointed to me by Mikhail and Yobert. They told me, have you heard of Search Spotter? Yeah, but I've never used it. And then Mikhail showed me some of the results he's found. And he's like, yo, you should look into this. This may help you a little bit. See what you can do with it. So I actually sat down so the way Search Spotter works is a very good, it's just an API. So you give it a domain, and it gives you a JSON response with all the certificates that it's found. So using JQ, you can parse through all that data and just pull all the domains you want, which plays a huge role of finding all the certificates when you want to do automation. So I leverage Search Spotter along with Sublister now. Just so they're the only 2 tools I use to get all the supplements that I want.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. So you cut out Shodan then altogether as well?
So I go to Shodan when I think I want to find something very specific. If I want to find a very specific port, if I want to find a very specific Jenkins, for example, or something that I can enumerate via a header or a title, whatever that is. So I can do that also.
Yeah.
Or if I want to, so the other best thing about Shodan is you can search by the IP space that they own based on the organization name. And I always try to tell people organization name and host name are two different things. You find different result when you filter by host name versus you filter by organization, because the organization could own IP addresses that could not come up with host name.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
So I go after those as well in a different way. So those are stuff that I haven't automated because they're my last resort when I want to find more stuff and better stuff.
Yeah, the juicier things. There, yeah, it's come a couple times. I think it was actually John who was tweeting about it. Shodan and Elasticache. Yeah, I think if you look for Elasticache on Shodan, like the number of results that come back are insane. And the amount of data that's out there. Now, the problem is you have to somehow tie that to some type of organization. But it's a good example. Like if you just wanted an example of what it's like to go out there and find open assets, the tweet that he had about looking for that is a good one, at least for getting an idea of what that actually looks like in the wild. So one of the other things that you and I had talked about was looking at like the amount of Recon resources that are out there right now. Like there's this baseline that's been created, right? Like it's unfortunate that Jason Haddix couldn't join us for this talk as well, but he's got his How to Shot Web, round 1 and round 2 talks. Round 2 goes through a whole bunch of different tools, but the information is out there, right? Like everyone kind of knows how to do Recon. Like I put that in quotes. So let's dive into that. Like what differentiates like the good Recon hackers versus the not so good Recon hackers from your perspective, and why do you think you've been able to elevate your game after identifying it as a weakness in your hacking?
So I mean, it's really good to know. There's a difference between knowing the tools and how to use the tools, and also the question of where to use the tools, right? So it's good that you know, like, oh, there's all these different tools out there you can use. You can do all these cool things with them. But how are you going to make sure you use every single one of those tools for every single target?
Right.
So if you're doing all that manually, it's going to drive you insane because you're going to have to find subdomains, scan them one by one, run 20 different tools one by one. Yeah. So what elevated me was I just automated all that.
Okay. So what does that look like? What is the automation? Is it bash scripting? Is it like just taking all of the commands, like say for sublister and then directory brute forcing and what have you, and then just popping it all into one bash script that just kind of goes through them one by one, or is it much more intricate than that?
So let's take a step back from that first before we talk about how. So the first thing was what tools I wanted to use. Okay. So a couple of weeks ago, I was just popping up different servers, like, and then installing different tools. And I got tired of it, so I started making a list of tools that I always use in my Recon process, which I released a script for. I said, hey, if you want to use the tools that I use, here's a script, installs all of them for you. Here's a list of what I use. So I narrowed down my list of the must-have tools for Recon. Okay. Right? So those are the tools, some of the ones that in my last release, I made a small list. Those are the ones that I started with. And then I added some bash commands that, like, example, I look for the host command. I do a dig command on some of them. So I've automated all of that using bash. I didn't want to go down the route of using Ruby or Python. When you go to use Ruby or Python, then it comes down to a question of, oh, well, what dependencies do you need? What libraries you have to install? And then if you want to pass that along, you have to worry about creating all that list and all that stuff. Versus with bash, I'm just running tools and just curling them. And I let my install script handle the rest of the dependencies for all the tools that I'm using, right?
Okay, nice.
So what I've done for the script right now, so what I'm working on, and hopefully this will be done very soon, is right now it's just purely creating a bunch of functions. So each tool has its own function. Okay. And within that function, I'm defining how the tool works. So the command that I use for that function. So if I'm using Python 3, directory dir search.py, and then all the parameters that I'm giving it to, and then I give it the website name, and that goes for all the tools that I use. So that's the number one step that I've taken. Okay. Number two was figuring out, okay, so let's say you go and do Recon on Yahoo. That's a huge list of domains you're going to find. How do you find the right domains? How do you dedupe them? And then the other question becomes, how do you process all the stuff you have found? Because that's like 130 subdomains, for example, some random numbers, 135 subdomains you're finding. How do you visualize all that data? Mm-hmm. So this is my last step was that this is the only thing that needs to be finished is I've actually drop the recon process because it's something that works for me at the moment right now, and I'm focusing on generating a report based on each target for myself.
Okay.
So what it does is run tools A, B, and C. For example, A, B, C, D, you run those tools,
Yeah.
and then you collect all that data, you put them in a certain folder with a date, because you don't run recon once on a target, you can do it multiple times.
Yeah.
So based on that date, it does all the tools, it generates the reports, and then it grabs a screenshot using a tool,
Yeah.
and then it generates a visual guideline for me to look at that specific target. So I can go look at Yahoo, and it breaks it down based on each supplement that it's found, and that has an HTML report. I click on it, it gives me my dig, my host, my directory search, all the 200, 302s, 401, 403 directories that it's found in a text box, for me not to have to go and look at it in my without. That makes it more organized for me. So I have a list of all of them in a Apache index file. I just click on the target that I want, and I just look at the results.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That totally resonates. I know for me, like I said, for me, it's one of the things I struggle with is like I know that recon is a weakness, and then it's like, okay, I should sit down, I should try to automate this kind of stuff, right? Because just like you said, like I know what should be done out there. Like I've read all the documents I need to read. I've read all the blog posts. I've read the write-ups. But it's just like, oh, I've got to sit down. I've got to actually do that. And for me, it's kind of like that doesn't feel like hacking time. So then I go to do that, and it's like, oh, I would much rather just go and dive into this application, and there potentially be like a payoff right away. So it's interesting to hear that. I'm curious, have you looked at, or are you contemplating, like, this is something that I, again, have envisioned doing, is like just a one-click setup, right? So Yahoo, for example, I wanted to turn my attention to Yahoo tomorrow. I would just kind of, like, let's say it's a Slack integration, because I've heard of other hackers doing it. I've seen some good examples on GitHub as well, just like Slack, new project, Yahoo, and then that fires off a command to the server that then runs, like, the brute forcing, the subdomain enumeration, HTTP screenshots, what have you, end mapping. Have you looked at that? Have you considered that? Does that fit into what you're doing now, or?
So my entire process is I just type in recon target, that's it.
Okay.
I just go on the terminal. So this is another thing that I think I should have talked about earlier that slipped my mind. I also released another thing that was called Bash Recon Profile, right? Where I've created a lot of aliases in my Bash, so I don't have to worry about the technical details of how the tools work.
Yeah. Because
I've used the same exact parameters for each tool, or arguments for each tool, that I've created an alias. So even with my scripts, I use those aliases to make it easier for myself. So for example, the very last alias that I've made is called Recon, which calls a bunch of other different scripts or a bunch of different tools or aliases that does the process for me. Yeah. So you have to make sure you can cut down your work. If you're typing the same thing more than 5 times on a daily basis or even a weekly basis that you hack, then you for sure are able to automate it. You have to find it automated. That's what made the speed. That's what it's made the speed of. Instead of me focusing on doing that, it's just giving me a huge boost in my speed and how fast I work with Recon.
It's. I want to underline that specific point, because you and I had talked about that a while ago, again, it's just one of those things where it just becomes so easy. It's like, oh, eventually I'll learn that command, but there's no need to do that. And I remember you mentioning that. I implemented that. And it saved me a ton of time, and I happen to subscribe to the idea that, like, you only have so much brain capacity in a day, and so all these little things are adding up. So if you're looking at doing recon, for whoever's watching this, listening to this, like, that fundamentally should be what's underlying everything you're doing with recon, is find the ways to just stop doing repetitive things, because it just eats away at you and your motivation, at least for me, with hacking.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be just the tools. I have, like, commands that I've automated, like log SSH into my server. I've automated that. I just type in my server name, log in, and I put my password in. Or I do like different tools. Like, it's just like I've gotten tired of like having that mental checklist in my head of what tools and how to use them, that I just got tired, and I said, screw this. I'm going to just find a way to automate it the easiest possible way. And Bash seems to be the easiest way, because most of the time you are in a terminal doing a recon because of all the tools. So why not just build that around Bash? So you don't have to focus on one language. If you're doing Python, you have to focus on Python tools, or Ruby tools, or mix them both. Just use Bash, so whatever Go Ruby, Bash tools, whatever you find, it could all go into one as well.
Yeah. I love that. That's awesome. A quick side note. I'm curious because you talked about you were spinning up VPSs and then tearing them down and that kind of stuff. With this setup, it's purely a Bash script that you have in like GitHub. You just pull down and then you run that way. Like there's no need for say Docker or any type of image to pull in different stuff you need. It's just you've stuck with one server now. Everything's installed there.
So I use one. This is funny because this is a problem that everybody deals with. I use one service provider because you can't use the same VPS every time because Cloudflare hates researchers. They don't hate researchers. Cloudflare blocks you. Maybe researchers hate Cloudflare, right?
Yeah.
But it just isn't easy. So I just have I created my server. I created an image just in case my image gets screwed with. I have a script that just pulls all the tools, installs them for me right on boot.
Oh, nice.
My first boot does all that stuff for me, and then I just go in and type the same command. So I pick up what I left up on my last server. Yeah. But if I want to transfer data, I can just take an image of it, just pull it to the other server, and then reboot that image, or spin up that image. So I cannot emphasize this, and I didn't think this was an important part. Keep all your data, keep all your recon, and we'll talk about why in a little bit as well. But keep all that data that you've collected and transfer it to the next server. So find a good provider that allows you to do all that stuff. And I use Vultr, and Vultr has a very good API that I haven't gone this far, but I can go as far as spinning up a new server automatically for myself within my Bash script.
Right. Yeah.
So I haven't gone as far as doing that. So ideally, at one point, I want to start spinning off different servers for different tools, so it gets done faster. Instead of splitting it, I can just use different tools that are put it on that server itself.
Yeah. And
then just get all the data collected to one server, but I haven't gone that far. But that would just give me another boost in my speed and how fast I work with Recon.
Yeah, the nice thing about that would be too, like when you have on-demand instances, like you don't have to pay to keep it up, right? Like you can spin something up for an hour, 2 hours, whatever it is that you need to do, have it go, pull the data out, and then rip that down, and then you're paying maybe a couple bucks, even if at that. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that either.
And just to make it a little bit clear, I'm not going after a $300 a month box. Sometimes I have because it's a huge target that I want to get done in an hour.
Yeah.
But this box that I have, it's purely a $10 a month box that has a bunch of different screens running in the background as I sign out, just doing Recon and just doing Recon at the end. And then I just go after a couple of hours, or I do it at night. I come back in the morning and hopefully it's done by then if it's not big enough. And then I start looking at the reports. Or I start doing, I look for patterns of what I've found in the past.
Yeah, and it was a nuance there, but I think an important one because it probably took me longer to realize this than it should have, and I learned this back when I was developing. But the screen tool, when you log into a box, you can use screen. And screen just allows you to have different processes that are associated with kind of what's going on. So you'll log into it, but screen will persist while you log out instead of killing that process. So when you're running subdomain enumeration, screen will keep that going. So you can just go back to the details after. You don't have to stay connected to it.
And just to point out how important those bash aliases are, I've even shortened my screen command to an S.
Yes, me too. I have SLS, so I can see what's going on with it. And
I just type an S, and it puts a new screen for me and a new session for me, and I just use that. It's just how far I've gone to just make it as fast as I can. Just an S, not typing screen, S. Just make it easy for yourself.
Exactly. That was one of the first things I did after you and I were talking about that stuff a while ago. So we're going to get into a couple other things, but I'm curious. This is probably the way to go into it now. If you had limitless time, what would you pump out tomorrow from a Recon perspective? And is it are you doing this because you're developer and programmer right out of the box, or do you think anybody could get into this type of automation?
I am far from a developer. I don't have a very strong developer background.
Okay.
Compared to most of the hackers that are developing tools, a lot of the stuff that I write is just me mostly being curious to how I can write this, and then going on Google and just figuring out different ways of to building that idea the way I want it to be built.
Yeah.
The reason I like to do Bash, and I wanted to make sure people understand this, is programming in Bash is super easy, and there are so many different resources out there that you don't have to be a guru, or you don't have to be a huge programmer that understands every programming language and how everything works for you to make this recon happen. It could just be, you have to find what works best for you and start looking for resources that are out there. What I'm doing may be specific for hacking, but there's a lot of IT or admins who want to do something similar to this. So example, how do I do X, Y, and Z with a list of hosts? The X, Y, and Z doesn't matter because we do different things with those, but how to process that list of domains or how to fish that list of domains, it's all the same across the entire IT pen testing, whatever team you're on. So you can look for those different resources, and that's what I leverage. So I go and look for, hey, how do I, when I first started doing all this, learning about Bash a couple of years ago to automate some stuff, was just looking for how did people in IT and people that are managing different boxes, different hosts, how do they manage those? So I look for resources, and it's like, oh, they just use 3 lines of script. They read a file for every line. You do whatever you want to do. Yeah. I understood that process, and I just started writing code around that.
Oh, okay.
So if you look at my code, it's a bunch of repetitive code.
Yeah.
The way I want it to work, and then it's in an order that I want it to be working as well. So how I do my recon in that order is also because of the time that it takes, because of how valuable that information is. Do I want it first? Do I want it last? Right. Whatever that is, you have to do that.
So on that note, like we talked about integrating with the API from the perspective of spinning up, spinning down, just like you were saying, like setting up a server. What's missing in your recon now that if you had unlimited time, you would add?
So one of the things that it's missing right now, which isn't a big step, but I want to eventually do is I want to diff my results of my previous recon with this one. So now I have added it. So before it would just do, target, and then it would delete it for a new scan and start another one.
Oh, okay.
Which will come back and tell you what I was missing out on those. Yeah. But what I started was I just added a date to the end of it, so I know what date. And then I realized like sometimes in one day I run the same command twice. Yeah. So when you do the same date, I start adding an hour to it. So I realized like a lot of this stuff matters. And then the next thing I want to add to is going back to the diff thing, I want to be able to automate the diff. So it tells me, hey, there was 3 new subdomains found in this time that you ran this command, and then notify myself via an email or whatever that is. Right. So those are the things that I haven't done. But I want to be able to do that in a way that is more efficient rather than what's been done in the past. Is it Slack? Is it using another tool that's something out there? Or do I want to just simply be my server sending me an email and telling me, or do I want to send me an email and do other things to it?
Right. The diff thing is interesting. Like let's dive into that. Let's dive into that example because we've talked about it a couple of times and wanted to come back to it. Let's just go into it now. Having that historical data, like how important is that for you? What's that look like for your hacking now versus when you started this recon process? Because I know for me, I do both, right? Like I keep historical data, but then I never seem to go back to it. But it also seems to play into like how you visualize your own data. So I'm curious about all of that.
So one of the reasons why I like to keep my data from like whatever I've ran a scan is because I want to know if I've missed a bug, first of all, if it wasn't my scans, and how I can avoid that in the future.
Oh, okay.
And number 2, which is the best one that I wasn't looking at, was, let's say I'm looking at, example, Google. Maybe that's a bad example, but let's just throw it out there because they have a big enough scope. Mm-hmm. Then I find a third party with a known vulnerability. So let's say I find something with weak credentials. So I find, let's say I find a JBoss login panel, right? People seem to forget that you have a ton of data from your previous scans from other companies that may also have JBoss instances installed on them that you may have never looked at. So I found on a private program on HackerOne one day, I found a JMX console on a host, right? Then I put an admin or whatever the password was, it logged me in. I was like, ooh, so this works on this host, on this particular domain name. Mm-hmm. Let's go ahead and, so one of the best things about directory search or dir search, the Python tool, is that every time it does a scan for you, if you allow it specifically, it would keep a report document for that time that you ran the scan. So that goes into the reports folder of that tool. So what I do is, that's something I haven't automated, well, it's been a bash alias automated, then I type in the bash alias, and then I grep for that folder name or whatever that tool was. So I go and say, look for all the reports that I've created using directory search, and give me all the JMX consoles that are 200 or 401.
Right.
So if you don't, if you delete your historical data, you can't go back and find those.
Yeah.
And then having two different reports from like today and last year, if that was their last year, that means I missed it because the one from yesterday no longer works. So in my mind, I say, okay, how do I automate it so I don't miss out on these? You just, every time it pops up, it's a 200 or 401, whatever that response code is. You make it either generate a report for you that alerts you like, hey, this just came up, check for it. Or you just send yourself a note, make a Slack channel for it, for example, or have it get highlighted in your report that you create at the end of your job. So for me, it's at the end of each recon process, what I call it. Yeah. Once my recon target.com is done, it makes an HTML report, and some things get highlighted that I need to look at because they're important.
Interesting.
So you don't want to miss that. So what I want to communicate to everybody I want to encourage people to look into is, if you find a third-party software that has a vulnerability or has known credentials, think of where else you can do that to. Because chances are that company isn't the only one that's using JBoss or Tomcat, whatever that is. Or that one subdomain isn't the only subdomain that has used a specific admin panel that's called admin123, for example.
Yeah.
So if you grep for admin123 reports for that one domain, for one organization, or all the other organizations you have scanned, you have a bigger attack surface for all those companies, or that same company, they can just maybe find 5 RCs that way.
That sounds like a pretty sweet deal. There was a specific point that popped into my head, but now you've got the wheels turning on so many different things. There's so much in that specific nugget. In terms of having that historical data, going back through things, I think there's a lot of value, especially when you're looking at like what you talked about. Like once you find a default configuration, like there's no going to that vendor and saying, hey, like this is. It's not like the vulnerability lives within that specific vendor. It's something that's easy to screw up and apply that everywhere. And so when you have that data, there's a lot that you can take away from that. The other thing and it's interesting because this came up in a conversation at work at Shopify with colleagues this week, because I don't have this mindset, and it's almost like this seems to be the most effective way to do this. But like I always try to categorize whatever it is that I'm developing, right? So it's like I know where I put things in folders, and then so I know where to go back to it. But it's much more effective once you get into that mindset of searching for things. So like when you're grepping for things, it doesn't matter where you put anything. You can just grep for specifically what you're looking for. And then, again, going back to that mental capacity per day, it just frees you up to just, I'm just going to dump this all in this folder, but I know that it's all standardized structure. And so I can search for whatever I need to search for. So for those listening, like that, fundamentally, if you were to take anything away from that, it would be keep your data and get into that search mindset. That's awesome.
And to summarize everything I said earlier, if I could just summarize it really quickly, would be if you find something vulnerable in one place, the chances are that other companies have made the same mistake. If not, that same company has made that mistake probably multiple times in different places, right? So something for like a Tomcat instance, it's easy to find those. Fingerprinting, I'm not fingerprinting stuff that way to where I can specifically find a instance of that software, but some of them are very obvious. Some of them are, just slash JMX console slash manager HTML. It doesn't have to be going straight for those. It doesn't have to be third-party software. You find a Swagger API documentation on one, you can find it across a bunch of them. You may find it on a staging site, but the API isn't there, but the API could be on the product side or the prod side, right? So you can go and start messing with that as well. So you want to make sure you have all that data and you look at it across the entire organization versus on that one particular domain. And if you want to go a step further and make money across the entire platform or entire bug bounty platform, is you go and find that same exact mistake across all the companies that are there. Which kind of brings us to our next point I wanted to talk about was, how do you also automate that? Right? Which also goes to something I haven't done, and I encourage people to. I think Arkady from Airbnb has started this already for a lot of us, where he has a list of all the domains from all the public programs, and that's a huge scope right there. If you have your automation done right, all you have to do is feed it that list, every month or every week, whatever that is, and just make sure your data is super organized so you can go back to it and you can actually see all the data that you found. If you're not organized, and that's something that I'm talking about from experience, is that if you don't organize your data, you're going to just be running in circles trying to figure out what you're doing.
Yeah, yeah. That's I had that in the notes to talk about that perspective of taking out even like organized data, um, but then also organizing kind of like the information that you're feeding to your tools, right? So if you have a standardized structure, just like that, you can go just crawl through all the different programs, pull out all the scopes, combine that, and then again take your automation that we've talked about, where it's like one-stop shop. It pulls out, here's my specific domain, so I'm going after Yahoo, I'm going after Uber, what have you, um, and the tool just runs and kicks that all off, and then just notifies you. That seems to be like the holy grail. So yeah, um, is there anything else that came to your mind that you kind of want to touch on before? I know we've taken up a lot of your time, so I'm conscious of that. But is there anything else that you think is worth mentioning in terms of effective recon?
Not really, but it's just recon isn't something you can't just go ahead and say, I want to start doing recon. You have to be passionate about it.
Yeah.
And I've been doing bug bounties for about 4 years now, right? And it's taken me 3 years to actually create that courage to actually tackle down recon, let
Yeah.
alone actually enjoy doing recon. But the one thing that I've noticed on my end when I do recon is that I rely on recon too much now. So I, if I don't find something interesting doing recon, I don't dive into the app. I don't bother looking at what that app hosts anymore. Like maybe there are other files that just cross-site scripting on there. There might be some files that may have SQL injection in them. I haven't fallen in love with that aspect of like, okay, maybe I should now start looking at each of these scopes or each of these domains and see what they're hosting. So don't let the idea that, oh, Recon's making me enough or Recon's finding me enough bugs get in the way for you to find vulnerabilities on the actual application itself.
Seems like a nice problem to have, though. I would
It
like
is,
to be in that same situation.
but that goes to recon burnout because
Yeah.
if you forget your passion or your methodology for looking for vulns within the application, once you get burnt out on doing recon, you have nowhere to go.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that plays both ways, right? I've definitely been feeling it like the last month or 2 months where it's like, I got to a point, I never thought that I would know how to go after cross-site scripting. And it's not to say that I'm a cross-site scripting expert by any sense of the means, but I feel like I've found enough of them where I start going into an application and it's just, I start peppering in the payloads. And then it's like, it's exactly what you talked about, where it's kind of like it's you get burnt out. It's kind of like this is getting a little bit boring. So it's almost like having that happy medium. With Recon, it seems like if you can get to the one-stop shop with one click, notify yourself of interesting stuff, it allows you to at least have that time to focus in on an application while that's going on in the background, and maybe find a happy medium. Um, so yeah, all that to say, Ben, I guess when I envisioned these hacking pro tips, I always thought I would take like 15 to 20 minutes from a person. We've now hit a 43-minute mark, so I can't thank you enough.
Yeah.
This was awesome. I mean, even from the most selfish perspective of trying to figure out how my own recon can be improved, I think this is going to help just a crazy number of people. So hopefully everyone watches it when we publish it on Twitter, Bug Bounty Forum, and get it out there. Thanks very much.
And yeah, not a problem. I appreciate you having me.
Right. All right. So everyone, hopefully we'll see you for the next web hacking pro tips deep dive. Ben will probably be joining me again, and I'm sure we'll have something cool to talk about because, as you've heard, we have no shortage of cool bugs coming off of the HackerOne platform, as well as the other bug bounty programs that are out there, Bugcrowd, Synack, and what have you. So all I'd say, thanks very much. We'll see everyone. Ben, we'll talk to you later.